burning bush story of Sunday school fame depicts Moses minding his own business. He was in the sheep business by that time, and Egypt was in his rearview mirror. He was at a nondescript spot in the big wilderness when a bush caught fire and talked to him in a softly thundering voice. God spoke to Moses from a shrub that appeared to be on fire with a deep, echoing voice for radio. Well, most of that is true. In my recent review of the biblical details, God revealed new information to me that forced me to reevaluate the Sunday school account. And no mention of God's tonal quality was described, but I'm pretty sure he had the vocal pipes of a late-night FM jazz radio DJ. The New International Version translation clarifies that Moses was, quote, at the far side of the wilderness, unquote. That's like saying Moses had moved the flock to that you can't get there from here place in the desert. The New King James Version calls it, quote, the back of the desert, unquote. And it made me wonder why Moses was so far removed from whatever he was so far removed. Was there no grass closer to his father-in-law's camp? Moses saw the strange bush burning without being consumed by the fire. And when the bush began telling Moses about holy ground and going barefoot for the performance, things got weird. I believe God had finally gotten the full undivided attention of Moses. And then God gave Moses a do-over. His divine assignment as a redeemer was reissued with God's special validation. We all know the story, but the God of the bush recently fired it up all over again for me. His light provided me with an entirely new understanding that I'm passionate about explaining to anyone familiar with the famous details. I believe a hidden miracle lives in the Passover Backstory. Moses did receive an incredible call from God. Moses didn't want it. He had changed his address from the palace to a tent, and Moses didn't want a do-over. He couldn't face the pain of failure again. In his head were images of a murdered taskmaster, angry slaves, and a failure loop was playing. That didn't work before. This ain't gonna work now. It never works out for me. Even the famous missing Passover chorus was heard. Nobody likes me, everybody hates me. I'm going to eat unleavened worms if I can find a Walmart with an ethnic Jewish section. Well, Moses may have been afraid and confused about what God intended. Moses had been up close and personal with the unquestioned authority of Egypt's king. He knew the tremendous power of Pharaoh and the utter helplessness of the slave population. And Moses may not have understood that God did not intend to fix a bad government or create a regime change. God's plans often transcend politics and focused on long-range, eternal matters. That's why our short-term, temporal concerns often seem to conflict with God's will. God had a master plan that was beyond human comprehension. The words and attitudes of Moses revealed that he just did not believe God could use him to achieve God's goals. Instead of going all in, Moses went all out. Before God had finished his message to Moses, he may have already been working up a quick list of pathetic excuses. Inside his head, the loop was probably replaying a dead taskmaster scene, followed by a flashback to insubordinate, judgmental Hebrew slaves cursing him. But God didn't want Moses to personally solve the slave problems of Egypt. God just wanted Moses to be a messenger. His call was to simply take a telegram from a burning bush to Pharaoh and to his fellow Hebrews. However, even that limited assignment likely caused Moses to begin playing and replaying the failure loop in his head. He told God, "They won't believe me." If we believe in God and if we want to honor Him, why do we reach the same wrong conclusions? God, I'd go witness and I'd go offer to pray for people. I'd testify, but they won't believe me. Who are we doubting at that point? You know, it's not up to us what people believe or how they respond to the message. The call from God is ours to obey. We're only responsible to bring the message. Then we just must leave the results in God's hands. And personally, I think that's easier. The actual message from God to His people was magnificent. I mean, Moses was sent to declare the first Emancipation Proclamation. The Bible says, God is finally ending your slavery, you're free. Moses showed up with the winning envelope from the Publishers Clearinghouse. You've won. You're moving to a land flowing with milk and honey. It's all good news, folks. I guess Moses knew the people had a loop playing in their heads, too. You see, after 430 years in Egypt, all they knew was, it's going to be another bad day. Every time a day ends in Y, it's a bad day. It's going to be a bad day. The message Moses was instructed to deliver to Pharaoh was very different. The slaves and I are taking a little trip. We need to go worship in the wilderness. We won't be gone long, so don't worry. The itinerary is short and sweet. Hike for, 2 or 3 days. We'll have an abbreviated worship service. Somebody will pass the turban for a quick offering. I've prepared a humorous anecdote with the cute application to my message, a pithy 3-point sermon, followed by a brief altar call. Give us a couple of more days, to walk back, and within a week or so, I'll have them all back at work. It'll be all right, Pharaoh. The appeal began as a pretty simple request to Pharaoh. Yet Moses was still afraid. And this was all still just, God and him out at the bush. But Moses' response to God's plan revolved around his fear that nobody would believe him. It's kind of like my fear and your fear, I think, when we're supposed to just share the love of God, the coming of Messiah, our understanding of our faith. We're supposed to just share it. We're messengers. God tried to ease the fears held by Moses. He said, okay, tell you what, I'll crank out a few miracles, then I'll make them an offer they can't refuse. And at that point, I think Moses cracked. He just couldn't handle the intensity of what God was asking. So, how bad was it? Moses then said, well, I'm not good at public speaking. I could be wrong here, and I sincerely mean no disrespect to people with speech impediments. But why is it assumed that Moses really had a speech impediment before the bush flared up? I mean, maybe he did, but maybe not. Consider a later post from God in his sequel to the Old Testament. The New Testament said Moses was taught all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he became a mighty prince and orator, unquote. There was no mention of a lisp, stutter, or speech impediment. God knew the fear in the heart of Moses. The thought of returning to Egypt paralyzed Moses. The alleged public speaking problem, well, that was another matter. I'm just not convinced that Moses had a speech impediment. It sounded more like Moses had a spinal disorder, a missing backbone that had gotten left behind in Egypt. Maybe God wanted him to return to where he had lost it, so Moses could become the leader God had destined him to be. I couldn't find any record of Moses stuttering when he spoke to his wife or when he called his sheep. There were no notes mentioning a speech problem in his student file at the Egyptian prep school he attended. No stutter was mentioned at his first visit to all the Jewish people or when he whacked the taskmaster. I mean, it's possible he had a problem. It's also possible if any of us heard from God through a burning bush, we'd develop a nervous affectation ourselves. God wanted Moses to be his spokesperson. Much later in the story, God got what he wanted from Moses. I quote, "The Lord told Moses to be his spokesman to the people of Israel," unquote. And there was no more stuttering excuse from Moses recorded at that time. I think he got his backbone back and he was healed. The failure loop in his head was erased and replaced with a new loop, encouraging Moses to trust the Lord. But for now, we must return to when Moses was still barefoot at the bush. When Moses told God to send someone else, God was perfectly prepared. God already had a plan. From the bush, God said, "All right, your big brother Aaron will go with you. He's a good speaker. And by the way, he's coming here and he'll be your spokesperson." God systematically removed each excuse Moses raised. And in the spirit of Passover, I have another question. I don't think this question has ever been presented in any Haggadah. Was Aaron God's plan B? In my opinion, absolutely not. During a recent rereading of the textual material, I finally had to ask, what's going on here? I mean, what do these inferences mean? I think God showed me some things that changed how I interpret the old Sunday school account. Let's think about the timeline for this Passover backstory. Moses had been on a long hike into the wilderness. It was described as far, far away on the backside of the desert. Aaron was also going to be required to march a very long way into a very, very hostile wilderness. There were no handy 7-Eleven stores or convenience rest stops. He was going to be required to find Moses without any GPS or tracking device. An entire generation had died off during the 40 years that Moses was hiding out, exiled in the wilderness. And 40 years is a long time for a guy to be registered as MIA and off the grid. And Aaron was no spring chicken. By the time he got back to Pharaoh, Aaron was 83 years old. Think about it. How many 83-year-olds launch out on a lonely wilderness hike for an indeterminate amount of time to an unknown location in an uninhabited desert? Let me count, like none. This family reunion between big brother and little brother took a minimum of 40 years to organize. And I say a minimum because I believe it was probably longer, closer to 80 years. Remember, Moses was Aaron's little brother. Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. Moses was just a tiny infant when that happened. Aaron was only 3 years old. I don't think the mother of Moses said, "Hey, listen, Aaron, there's something you need to know. I really didn't drown your brother as ordered. He's alive. And you know that kid that I'm nursing when I go to work in the morning? My paycheck is coming from the king of Egypt so I can nurse my son Moses. What I'm trying to tell you, Aaron, that little kid is your little brother Mo." Come on. How many of you know that little kids talk? Without a Twinkie or a box of goldfish crackers, you cannot shut a little kid up. And these items and the things that shut kids up are not kosher for Passover anyway. So the smart parent's rule of thumb is this: never tell a little kid a secret if it means you die when he blabs. I'm just not convinced that Aaron even knew Moses was his brother. If little Aaron would have known it and leaked it, that slip of the lip could have been devastating to their family. And then it suddenly dawned on me that it was in the odd realm of possibilities that Moses may not have really even known his big brother Aaron until God sent him to become his mouthpiece. And that lit up a whole new idea. I finally understood the purpose of Pancho, Tonto, and Robin. God established the world's first ancient sidekick hotline. You might wonder what a sidekick does. Well, without some dunderhead's antics to foul things up and provide comic relief, how could we fully appreciate a superhero? My friend, Aaron was no plan B. If Moses hadn't developed that stutter, the greatest excuse in the history of mankind would have rested on the laurels of Bowser. You know, the dog ate my homework. But thank God for his plan of dynamic duos. I know Cisco, Clayton Moore, Johnny Depp, and Batman do. By the way, most of my grandchildren know my real identity. If I'm unable to finish this conversation before my publisher's deadline, it's only because Gotham City needs me. Now, I guess it's appropriate to now crown the winner of our best ever excuse competition. It comes from a famous story on a mountain near a cliff. So let me give you the cliff's notes. Moses went up the mountain to get something from God, not knowing what a commandment was, but liking the price, today only free. Moses said, okay, I'll take 10. He hiked down the mountain with no backpack to holster his new commandments. And when he saw what his dunder-headed sidekick had done, Moses became the first man in history to break all 10 of the commandments. And using a Laurel and Hardy line, Moses said, well, here's another fine mess you've gotten us into. And then our superhero asked his big brother, how could you have possibly made this golden calf? I mean, what were you thinking? God is going to kill everybody. And the Bible tells us that Aaron suggested, and I quote, the people asked, what happened to Moses, who led us out of Egypt? He's gone! Exclamation point. Make us a god to lead us. Well, I told them, bring me your gold earrings. So they brought them to me. Now, I'm just going to read Aaron's excuse right out of the book. There's no better way to explain what happened to the gold earrings. I will just quote. So they brought them to me. I threw them into the fire and, well, this calf came out. Ladies and gentlemen, the winner is, and a hush falls over the crowd. We hear the rattle and rustle of the envelope opening. Yes, Aaron, he really said it. I threw them into the fire and, well, this calf came out. My kids said some pretty absurd things when they were growing up. There were times I just wanted to say, seriously? Did you really just say that? Really? And then I just laughed because it was so outlandish. But nobody ever said anything like, I threw them into the fire and, oh, I don't know, well, this calf came out. Moses was surprised. Was God surprised? No. God knew all about this from the start. Our God had a precise plan. He's trustworthy. God actually has a salvation plan of the ages that he has crafted with great care. And we need not act like our current little problem is a crisis that will hinder us from fulfilling our part in God's plan. It won't. If it's God's call, it's God's problem. Since nothing is a problem to God in His service, we got no problems. The mountains we see are merely challenges and opportunities for us to learn to trust Him. He cares about us and our concerns. God knows how pathetic we are. His plan is not dependent on how good we are at doing the things He's called us to do. We're not that good and God's not that dependent. We must choose to play a new success loop that reminds us that we belong to God and His plan is fully under His control. He has called us. He will help us achieve what He wants accomplished. And if we get bogged down hearing a contrary message to what we know is true, it's not from God. Change the channel in your head. If the current channel in your head says, oh, I'm too old, or I'm too young, I'm too weak, I'm too married, I'm not married enough, my kids this, my parents that. Change the channel in your head and quit your whining. Think about Moses. Remember, it could be worse. How bad could it be? Really? When Moses came down from Mount Sinai after receiving the law from God, all the wheels appeared to have fallen off the wagon train. Disaster struck. I mean, think about the golden calf mess. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Moses had just said yes to God instead of requiring a sidekick. Without Aaron, would there have been a golden calf? Aaron was responsible for one of the most epic fails ever. The golden calf fiasco is still on the list of dumbest decisions ever made since Eve went off her low-carb diet to lunch with a snake. We might have missed the world's best excuse if Moses had spoken for himself, but Moses would have skipped past one of his greatest tests. God was ready to wipe out the entire nation of Israel. Moses was unaware of what Aaron had done. He was still up on the mountain with God getting the 10 Commandments when God said, "Look, while you were away, your brother and his buddies did a very terrible thing. Now I'm going to destroy them all. But don't worry, I'm going to start over and make a new nation. This will be a great group, and you're going to love being the leader of this new and improved Israel 2.0 version." Moses didn't miss a beat. He thought of his brother and said, Oh God, don't do it. Don't hurt him. Don't kill him. Don't wipe him out. Preserve them. And that is why I believe Moses was the greatest servant leader in all human history who had ever been born of a man and a woman. In my opinion, no better strategist or negotiator existed. When God would become angry and He was ready to wipe out folks from among His own people, Moses instinctively fell on his face before God and begged Him to save those unworthy of salvation. Moses said, "Oh God, don't do that. They're your people. You brought them out of Egypt. It would look bad for you. It's going to ruin your brand." How many other leaders might have thought, that sounds pretty good. Kill the rascals. Let's just do this new thing. The beta version of Israel had too many bugs. But that was not in the heart of Moses. Some people think we Jewish folks, we make too much of Moses. I'm here to tell you we don't make enough of him. While all the chaos was happening in the valley of disobedience, and Moses was still up on Mount Sinai, I think God knew He would not wipe out the children of Israel. I believe God wanted the heart of Moses to be revealed to show the world how a humble servant leader behaves. We needed to see a Redeemer, a protector, a picture of Jesus who intercedes for us. God showed us this unique example by giving us Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our greatest rabbi. If we were all wise sons, we would study the life of Moses. We would emulate his humility. We would pursue his wisdom. We would read and remember his 5 books. We would learn what the prophets, priests, kings, and apostles learned from and taught about Moses. If we did these things, we would be better parents, siblings, pastors, rabbis, bosses, teachers, and better friends. We would care about other people more if we learned to care like Moses cared. If we mirrored the heart of Moses, we would humble ourselves and pray for the people around us. The world seems to cry out for justice. When I was young, that is what I believed the world lacked. I was wrong. Justice is too costly and will not satisfy the human heart. May God be merciful, because none of us can afford justice. The oppression of true justice is unbearable. How can a sinner stand before a righteous God? If justice is served, we perish because we're all guilty. Moses understood that God could be merciful. Therefore, the heart of Moses cried out for mercy to preserve his brother and his sister when pride overtook them. Moses cried out for mercy when the nation was moments away from being destroyed because of their idolatry. I'm glad that Moses did not call for justice against those who had offended him. Neither should we. He did not cry out for vengeance against those who treated him disrespectfully. Neither should we. Moses depended on mercy because he had seen the results of swift justice. When God's people disobeyed, justice was horrific. And so it will be on that final day of judgment. For those who do not know God's tender mercy, justice will be a merciless horror. Moses followed God's lead and punished those when God required examples of consequences to warn future generations. If we fail to read his record, how will we know and understand and believe? I mean, no one even knows where Moses was buried. If Moses had a headstone, I believe his epitaph would read, "I asked God to be merciful so we could rejoice when justice was averted and mercy flourished. And as one of his people, I rejoice because I know the mercy of God. He spared me from the just judgment I deserve. Mercy does flourish. And I am a grateful recipient. And this brings me near to the conclusion of this prequel section and Randy's rule of theology number 4. Trust God. We're not going off the rails. I don't know what you're facing. I don't know how bad it is. I do know it could be worse. Remember, if we all put our troubles on the table at a swap meet, would you run and take your own, or would you pick up someone else's? If you're foolish enough to pick up someone else's, it just means you do not know what could come next if you hold on and trust God. It could be worse. Don't think about that. Instead, rejoice. Give thanks to God for the good things that He's doing in your life. Remember the good things he has done for you and expect more good things. Like I said, we're not going off the rails. Change the channel in your head if it's not drawing you nearer to the Lord, and remember to pray. It seems when I'm at the Red Sea and I hear the sound of hoofbeats coming up behind me, I get scared. For the third time in my life, I'm scared like that again. Being that frightened puts a fellow in a place where impetuous decisions could lead to mistakes. May God help me hesitate. May God help me wait for his miracle. May God help me believe. May God help me. I need God. You know, about every 15 years or so, I'm forced to cry out to God and ask him to break into my life. I tell him he can do whatever he wants with me. Just break in. In those rare times when I've truly been ready for God's breakthrough, it only came after first reaching the end of myself, and I'm in that rather rare place again as I tell you this account. If you're in that place when nothing but a miracle will be sufficient, God must become your sufficiency. It was at times like this that I invited God into my life in a new way. In a sense, it's like leaving the door unlocked with a big sign. God, break into my life. Do whatever you want. The door's unlocked. Everything of value is out in the open. Nothing is nailed down. Oh God, break in. Take what you want. Do what you want. I trust you, God. I love you, God. Bring your breakthrough. If that is your desire, oh God, do what you want. But should a breaking be more productive in my life than a breakthrough? Lord, break me tenderly. I'm yours. Nevertheless, I do request a miracle breakthrough if you deem it appropriate. And if not, strengthen my faith to rejoice anyway in all things. I know you are good. You do all things well. By the way, thanks for allowing my life to be like a Passover. I know it ends well. Once again, I think I'm ready to give God a blank sheet of paper and invite him to draw any blueprint for the remainder of my life that he deems appropriate. I'm really thankful for his love, and that's the only reason I could promise to teach you the most effective prayer I know. No memorization is required, but you may want to jot it down just in case you hear the horses coming up from behind you and smell the murky seawater ahead. You have a pencil? The prayer was on the sign I left out for God. Try it. He loves you, and he's good at what he does.